This is the Sony A7R Mark IV, and for the last 12 months, this camera has been my workhorse.
Now, as a car photographer, megapixels can mean a lot to my clients. Starting from the Canon 1DS Mark II, I then moved on to the Canon 5D Mark II, Canon 5D Mark III, before finally moving on to this Canon 5DSR.
Now in 2015, this was an amazing camera. It had everything I needed for my car photography at the time. But having said that, after 3 or 4 years later, Canon hadn't done anything to update it still. There was the 5D Mark IV, but it wasn't really the higher megapixel replacement I needed for my work.
The way car photography has been moving these days is different to the era in which this Canon 5DSR came out. Back then, with car photography I felt was a lot slower. We would shoot more purposefully, there'd be more heavy lighting and more heavy retouching on each shot. Shots could be done more slower and methodically, but the way things are moving now with car photography, I kind of feel like it's going more and more shoot from the hip, more editorial, more natural, and therefore the requirements we have in cameras is also starting to shift and change. With this Canon 5DSR, I was doing tracking shots or car-to-car shots, and when you have a certain stretch of road to do your car-to-car shots, you generally have a limited number of runs you can do, whether it's because you have the location booked for a certain number of hours, or whether you just have a certain amount of time on a track before you have to wrap up your shoot and move on. There is a finite amount of runs you can do when it comes to tracking shots, shooting from car to car. Say for instance you're shooting along a bridge or a tunnel, it might take 10 or 15 minutes just to turn around and do another lap on that same tunnel to have a second run. That is assuming you don't have other traffic, that's assuming you don't have other issues or problems to manage whilst you're trying to do your tracking shots.
So given a finite amount of time and resources to do your tracking shots, the difference in write speeds, buffer and stabilization can effectively double the amount of your usable shots. So as a car photographer, what I really needed was a do-it-all camera that had the combination of megapixels and faster write speeds in a run-and-gun body.
The straw that broke the camel's back was essentially just having a 1 kilometer stretch of road, and in the first 1 or 2 corners the camera hits its buffer, and I spend the rest of the run watching the camera buffering and not being able to shoot anything.
With the Sony, the buffer is insanely faster, albeit not quite as fast as the A9 or the 1DX. It's not a dedicated motorsport camera, but it's the combination of megapixels, usability, up-to-date processors and a UHS-2 card formats that brings it up to today's speeds. This makes the Sony A7R Mark IV such a close to perfect car photography camera in 2020.
Of course, it goes without saying the Sony has much better files to work with. Notwithstanding the Canon R5, the Sony files have generally been much better than the Canons in terms of dynamic range and low light performance. I've been able to recover highlights and pull details which I've never been able to do with the Canon before. Now that's not to say that the Sony is not without its own faults. First of which that people don't often think about is Canon Professional Services. If you're actually a working professional photographer, the professional services each brand offers is extremely important as part of the ecosystem that you're investing in with the camera. You got to remember that when it comes to buying a camera, it's not just the camera body that you're investing in, it's the brand's ecosystem that you're investing in as well. It's lenses, how often do they update their camera bodies for you, and their professional services as well. Canon Professional Services have been fantastic. I've been able to get camera loans and urgent, quick repair turnaround times on damaged lenses and other camera bodies with Canon Professional Services without any problems. I haven't had that experience yet with the Sony. I've heard that the Sony Professional Services have improved a lot, but I haven't actually had a go with it directly just yet. Touch wood, I don't want to have to take my Sony into getting any repairs soon, but I heard that they're much better than they were before. Now the big thing that you may have noticed is the fact that I have not yet invested in Sony glass. I'm still adapting Canon EF lenses, and that's on purpose. Of course, autofocus performance suffers by adapting the lenses, but with the kind of car photography I do, that doesn't really matter. It's not one of those things that is important in my line of work. It may matter to you, and it will matter to a lot of other people, but I've been quite happy with adapting the lenses so far, and it allows me to utilize the same glass on my 5DSR if I ever needed to as a backup body. Image quality hasn't been an issue using the EF lenses. There's no glass in the adapters, but at the end of the day, what this comes down to is I've only barely dipped my feet in the Sony pool, and I haven't committed 100% in migrating to the Sony ecosystem. Now, with the Canon R5 now released, it's practically inconsequential now for me to switch back to the Canon R5 and still utilize my EF lenses. I could therefore have the Canon R5 as a primary camera and the Sony A7R IV as a backup camera if I need to, and then finally retiring my beloved Canon 5DSR. So the other things that I love about the Sony is its form factor. This is my first entry into full frame mirrorless, and the form factor is definitely a huge advantage over the Canon. I travel a lot, and I like to carry as much of my expensive equipment with me on the plane, so with carry-on, this is clearly advantageous over a big old chunky digital SLR. The camera uses dual UHS 2 card slots. I have to say, for now, today with stills photography, I would say that this is my favorite card format. It may not be the fastest, but I believe that it's the best combination of price, size, and speed, as well as accessibility. For video, it's probably not quite fast enough, but for stills photography, I think this is the best way to go. I love that it has the same card slot types on both of them, so you can switch them around easily. I do of course have an L bracket on my cameras as well. Andrew Link in New York was the one who introduced me to L brackets, and I've never looked back ever since. These L brackets are really helpful, especially when it comes to shooting in tight interior car spaces. Overall, I've been incredibly happy with this Sony so far. It was the best choice at the time because, to be quite frank, it was the only choice at the time. If you're looking for a 35mm full frame camera, you need the megapixels, you need the clean files, you need a larger buffer, faster shooting times, as well as image body stabilization for shooting cars. You didn't really have any other choice. But now Canon has released something. We do have a choice, and that is the Canon EOS R5. It's clearly the hottest camera on YouTube right now. Perhaps one day I'll be able to get my hands on one and see whether or not it's time to switch back. But until then, I don't feel the need to upgrade a camera just yet. Unlike with the 5DSR, which was so long in the tooth by the time I bought the Sony, I don't feel like the camera has been holding me back on my work. The Panasonic Lumix S1R is of course the third option in the room, but my main concern is if I did need superior autofocus performance, for instance track or motorsport photography, I'd be able to resort to buying native lenses for the Sony or using my EF lenses with the Canon R5. I'm a little bit worried that if one day I am in a situation where I need superior autofocus performance, I'd be limited by that contrast detect autofocus system in a Panasonic. It's also a little lower in the megapixel count. I know that's a terrible excuse and it makes little difference in actual photography, but some of my clients really need those extra billboard megapixels. In the meantime, I might wait and see what happens with the Sony A7R Mark V. And if I like the Mark V and where Sony is going, then maybe it's time that I sold my EF lenses and go all in on the Sony. I can then get the Sony A7S Mark III and then therefore live in the Sony ecosystem for both stills and video. It would be very efficient, because right now I have Canon EF glass for my stills and Micro Four Thirds lenses for my Blackmagic video work.
Ultimately, it's come down to Canon taking too long to update their 5DSR. In a way, the EOS R5 is more of an update to the 5D Mark IV, with the aging 5DSR still being ignored by Canon.
So there's my retrospective look of the Sony A7R Mark IV. After having been with Canon for the last 18 years exclusively, I kind of wonder now why I didn't switch to Sony A7R Mark III. I would have gotten more use out of it, and at the end of the day, making the switch with adapters isn't so hard after all.